this was not on the A-level syllabus before, so now it's on the A-level syllabus. So let's try and unpack this. So first of all, we need to recall, well, why do plants and animals need phosphorus? So there's an obvious thing there. There's the phospholipid, which is made in the cell membrane, the phospholipid, the hydrophilic head there, okay, of the cell membrane. So that's one use of it. The other use would be DNA has a phosphate. Phosphate, by the way, is O4, isn't it? So there's a phosphate backbone to DNA, and also in ATP. Okay, so it's a common chemical in living things: DNA, ATP, cell membranes. Okay, so how do plants take on board phosphorus? So it's found in rocks and dissolved in the oceans in the form of phosphate ions. And there's a connection there in that it tends to be fairly abundant in the oceans. And that's because if you know your geography, you'll see there'll be weathering of the rocks up in the mountains, and that will release phosphate ions. And then a lot of these phosphate ions will end up washed up in the sediments of the sea, especially on the shallow sea. There should be no limit of phosphate there. However, on farmland, and it might be a different thing, this could be a limiting factor. Okay, and so phosphate ions are dissolved in water and assimilated, that word again, made into complex molecules by plants and other producers. So this is going to be a bit of a difficult one to sketch out. So there's a lot of information here, so I'm going to talk you through it. We'll start with part one. So phosphate ions in the rock end up in the soil and then taken up through the plant. So one of the things that's different about this cycle compared to nitrogen is there's no phosphate in the air. So there's no need to fix phosphate, which makes it a slightly different cycle. It needs to come from the rocks into the soil and into the plants usually. Okay. And then obviously animals will receive phosphate from eating plants. And then when animals decay or in their feces and urine, the phosphate should go back to the soil and in a perfect world be recycled back into the plants. We're not living in a perfect world, so there'll be more about this, perhaps why this is on the syllabus. It's quite an important point. Now, in terms of what I just told you, in terms of the rocks, often there's weathering and erosion, and bits of rock are taken into rivers, end up in rivers, and then lakes, and then seas, okay? And so they're a driver of production of algae in the ocean, and that food chain supplies phosphorus for fish and for birds. And before Fritz Haber was able to synthesize ammonia, there are huge caves in Latin America that are full of guano, with huge amounts of guano. Now, what is that? These were caves where both where birds for hundreds of years have just left bird droppings, and it's all mounted up to a huge pile of guano. Okay, so in French, a huge pile of merde is there. Okay, and before Haber, we were shipping this out at an alarming rate to the West as a fertilizer. This guano is very rich in both nitrates and phosphates. And if you think about it, that is a way of recycling, if you like, the rock that made its way into the sea. These birds could be seagulls, well, they would be seagulls. It's like taking some of that phosphate back onto the land. So in that sense, it's fine. The problem with it was, however, was that because of the need for guano in nitrates, this was becoming non-renewable, as in we were mining it. We were mining far more guano than the birds were producing. So it was going down less and less. Okay. And so the human race, and we're talking about the 1920s here, was looking at starvation, looking in the face of starvation because of an exploding population and an ability to provide food. But then obviously Fritz Haber managed to fix nitrogen from the air into ammonia by adding hydrogen. Okay, so he saved millions and millions of lives. It's rather a sad story, though, because the reason he was doing that was to help the Germans produce nitrate-based explosives in World War I. And Fritz Haber was actually Jewish. So nitrate, as well as being a fertilizer, is an oxidizing agent that makes big explosions, folks, because look at all that oxygen. That's handy for flammability and therefore explosives. Okay. And so it's rather a sad story, Fritz Haber, because he was Jewish, but he actually became a Christian to try and further his career, but it didn't save him from Hitler. Hitler still sent him to the concentration camps anyway, irrelevant that he changed religion. It was all about it was his ethnicity. His ethnicity was a problem for Hitler, which is truly evil. But to be fair to Fritz Haber, it's like fertilizers were a byproduct of what he was working on explosives, let's face it, for the First World War, and he was very successful in making explosives in the First World War. And some could argue he played a pivotal role in not losing the First World War. But the good that came out of that was ammonia. We learned how to fix ammonia industrially, and that allowed us to make loads and loads of fertilizer. Our reliance on guano was less, so that reduced the shipping of guano. Now, to date, as I say, the ammonium-based fertilizers are made from the air, from nitrogen in the air, but phosphate, there isn't a source of it in the air. So all phosphate fertilizers now rely on mining. So let's have a look at that. So it's just a reminder that mycorrhiza are also used for phosphate. Okay, the plant gains nitrate and phosphate. The fungus gains hexose sugars as symbiosis. And you can see the difference. Look at the surface area. That fungi is busy scooping up phosphate far and wide. Okay. In general, there should be full recycling of the feces and urine. You know, nature does that, recycles it, and it should go back into the plant. The problem is, of course, human beings take out vast quantities of nitrates and phosphates, and the feces and urine of human beings is not necessarily returned to the land. Okay, that's one problem. The other problem is phosphate and nitrate-based fertilizers. Well, we'll get onto that a bit more, but a lot of it, a portion of it gets washed off into rivers and makes its way to the sea. You think about it, if while you're experimenting as a farmer, it's not easy or obvious how much phosphate to put on your land, and nitrate for that matter. Okay, and so the risks of putting too much nitrate and phosphate are actually that you waste money and it gets washed into the water and causes pollution, as we're going to see. But there's not actually a risk to your crop in general, unless you go crazy with it. There's no risk to your crop of putting more than enough fertilizer. But if you put less than enough fertilizer, you get a lower yield. Okay, so there's a tendency of farmers who are unsure of the precise amounts, and it is quite a complex science. If you're unsure of the precise amount of fertilizer, both phosphate and nitrate, to put onto your crops, the safest thing to do to ensure maximum yield is to slightly overdo it. Okay, because actually you're going to end up causing pollution for someone else. It's not going to be a big, okay, you've wasted a little bit of money by putting too much on, but you've got a maximum yield. You've got a huge crop yield in this way. Okay, so the system is broken a little bit. Well, the system being that it should fully recycle through feces and urine. Okay, well, what happens to human feces and urine? Well, in the old days, it just used to get pumped. Raw sewage in the UK up until about 1980 just got pumped into the rivers and went to the sea. And it wasn't even treated. Now they stopped that because it was playing havoc with the wildlife. But where does it go now? So that's something important to consider, that the system is broken. So let's have a look. So firstly, it's worth pointing out that the carbon obviously comes from carbon dioxide. The ratios for unlimited algal growth, but plant growth would be similar. 16 times more nitrate than phosphate is required. And so that's why the guano can still be mined today, but probably needs 16 times less, thanks to Fritz Haber and the Haber process there. Okay, so you need 16 times more nitrogen than phosphorus. So as I say, that's come from nitrogen in the air, fixing that nowadays. Okay, this is all mined. Okay, so we mine phosphorus if we're doing fertilizer. Obviously, one good practice, which is done in UK farms, is to use animal cow manure as a fertilizer. That is an excellent practice to do that, and that will recycle some of the phosphate. What about using human manure on crops? Now, you might be surprised to learn that that is actually done in this country. There was a big move away from using human sewage as a fertilizer when the cholera in the 1800s, the cholera outbreak was caused by human feces getting into the Manchester water and causing, terrible diseases from diarrhea. So the concern, obviously, about using human feces as fertilizer is bacterial problems. Now, so I'm telling you, some human feces is used on the fields. The concern has switched because they now know how to kill 99.9% of bacteria in human feces. We can do that with some kind of sterilization technique. But the problem now is that we don't. So I'll give you an example. Human urine would be an excellent fertilizer because it's sterile, doesn't have bacteria in it, and it's got loads of ammonia in. So you've got this kind of free source of nitrogenous fertilizer, human urine. And there's, if you think of a city like London, how much human urine could there be that could be put on the fields without danger? Well, the problem is it all gets mixed up with other chemicals. So women's contraceptives, traces of cocaine, drugs make their way into the urine, and then industrial chemicals make their way into the feces. So it's, in theory, it's a solution. In practice, there's a problem about if you could get sort of fairly pure human feces and fairly pure human urine, it would make an excellent fertilizer once you've got rid of the bacteria, which is easy to do. So we do some of it. Organic farms are banned from doing it because some of the feces tend to get mixed in with industrial waste and heavy metals, and so it's not considered that great. Well, it's a bit of a shame, but that might be a way forward. But anyway, the extraction of phosphate rock is toxic and energy intensive. It's non-renewable. It will reach peak supply in 2033, although we keep finding more. As the price will increase, they will find more, but also food prices will increase, and conventional farming could be reduced by half. So I think that is the reason. That's not in your biology book, but that's why we're studying this. Okay, it's an important cycle to understand. The potential value in human feces and urine is 40 to 50 million pounds. As I say, we do use some of it, but it's not as easy as it might sound. Okay, so instead we'd mine rocks, and we'd use guano, which is pure bird feces, and that's a way of taking phosphate from the sea and putting it back onto the land. Okay, so we are done. So just quickly, I don't know. Well, I say this looks complicated, but we're not really having to remember lots of long words. We're not having to remember all the bacteria. Obviously, bacteria will be decaying feces, and it should go back in the soil, and that's that it should be a perfect recycling. But obviously, human feces and urine take it off the land. So, although that looks like a very complex diagram, the terminology isn't too bad with this. Okay.